Elizabeth Taylor declared that Paul Newman was the sole individual who instilled in her a sense of dread regarding herself. These are not lines from a screenplay, but the hushed, final words of Elizabeth Taylor uttered in her last recorded interview before her passing. These few pronouncements were sufficient to send shockwaves through the entirety of Hollywood. For half a century, the world believed it understood their story. We were led to believe they were merely professional acquaintances, two incandescent stars of their era, moving through the vast firmament of cinema like celestial bodies on parallel paths. Taylor, a figure of legend, renowned for her amethyst eyes and a history of 8 marriages. Newman, the embodiment of unwavering devotion and humility. Yet this straightforward account has now been utterly dismantled. Few were aware that beneath the dazzling illumination of the set for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, amid scenes that appeared to be pure artifice, there existed something far more profound, a sentiment so deep, so genuine, that even they harbored a fear of articulating it. Taylor, a woman who had experienced the full spectrum of life, carried this unspoken truth within her for her entire existence, akin to an unhealed wound. Now that she is gone, her final utterances compel everyone to ponder the nature of this terrifying reality that Elizabeth Taylor concealed for over 50 years. To truly grasp fear, we must journey back in time. The luminous marquees of cinemas along Sunset Boulevard illuminated the nights, their glow reflecting upon faces deemed too perfect to be real. It was an epoch of unparalleled glamour, yet also a gilded cage. Each star lived under intense scrutiny, with gossip propagating at a speed that outpaced script distribution. Within this milieu, 2 names were universally spoken: Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman. They represented the quintessential dichotomy of Hollywood. At the age of 25, Elizabeth Taylor was already a preeminent force at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM. She was affectionately termed the Violet of Hollywood. Her iconic violet eyes and raven hair, her sheer beauty commanded absolute silence upon her entry into any room. However, behind this radiant facade lay a weary heart. Tragedy seemed to shadow Taylor's every step. Following a failed union with actor Michael Wilding and the devastating loss of her third husband, producer Mike Todd, in a catastrophic plane crash in 1958, Taylor succumbed to profound despair. She required a role that would serve as her salvation, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof emerged as a beacon of hope. On the opposing end of this spectrum stood Paul Newman. At 33, he was a rapidly ascending talent at Warner Brothers, fresh off the acclaimed success of Somebody Up There Likes Me in 1956, a performance that garnered significant critical praise. In contrast to his more gregarious peers, Newman was recognized for his unassuming demeanor. He was reserved, loyal, and utterly averse to the chaotic spectacle of celebrity. He had married actress Joan Woodward in early 1958, mere months before commencing his subsequent major undertaking. Many considered him an anomaly in Hollywood. While others reveled in extramarital affairs and public scandals, Newman found contentment at home, indulging in cooking, perusing scripts, and consciously evading enticements. Nevertheless, destiny, an element beyond even Hollywood's control, orchestrated their encounter. Following the untimely demise of James Dean, the pivotal role of Brick in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof became available. MGM sought an actor capable of conveying profound depth and a chilling detachment, with eyes that could bear the weight of the anguish Tennessee Williams had so masterfully penned. Their choice fell upon Paul Newman. Subsequently, when the female lead of Maggie the Cat remained uncast, Director Richard Brooks uttered words that instantly silenced the room. "No one can portray a woman consumed by unfulfilled desire more convincingly than Elizabeth Taylor," he declared. The stage was thus meticulously set for their fateful convergence. It was October 1957 on the sound stages of MGM Studios in Culver City, California. Eyewitnesses from that period recount the scene with remarkable clarity, as if it transpired only yesterday. As Newman entered the dressing chamber, Taylor was in the process of fitting her costume, a form-fitting white silk gown, her dark tresses cascading over her shoulders. He paused, momentarily transfixed. She offered a simple, serene smile and greeted him. "Hi, Brick," a brief salutation. Yet years later, Newman would confide the profound impact of that moment. He admitted that upon meeting her gaze, he was utterly incapable of recalling a single line from his script. From that precise instant, an invisible but palpable connection seemed to bind them. It was not a tempestuous or overt affection. Rather, it was a potent, understated and powerful force that instilled a sense of apprehension in both of them. She was the incandescent flame harboring inner solitude, while he represented the stoic ice, embodying the stability and fidelity she yearned for but dared not embrace. And in the artifice-laden world of Hollywood, where pretense reigned supreme, fate had deliberately cast them in the roles of a couple forced to suppress their genuine emotions. What remained unknown to all was that after their initial scene together, the demarcation between their acting and their true feelings became irrevocably blurred. The set of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof crackled not merely with the intensity of the studio lights, but with an unusual amalgamation of palpable tension and genuine human warmth. The pivotal scene was set to unfold within the oppressive confines of the bedroom, where Brick and Maggie, a husband and wife ensnared by silence and desire, were compelled to confront each other. Paul Newman sat upon the bed, his gaze as frigid as ice, fully immersed in his character. Elizabeth Taylor entered, the click of her heels resonating on the floor with a sharp, unwavering rhythm. The cameras began to roll. The inaugural scene necessitated Maggie, portrayed by Taylor, to implore her husband for affection. As dictated by the script, she was to lean in and gently rest her hand upon his shoulder. This gesture, meticulously scripted, nonetheless had an extraordinary effect, silencing the entire film crew. Newman did not respond as he had during rehearsals. Instead of adhering to the dialogue, he turned his face away, drawing a deep, ragged breath as if attempting to quell an overwhelming emotion surging to the surface. Director Richard Brooks, a man acutely aware of moments of genuine cinematic magic, did not call for a halt. He simply observed a faint smile gracing his lips and softly instructed them to carry on. When the scene finally concluded, Taylor remained rooted to her spot. Newman, visibly unsettled, avoided her gaze and quietly retreated to his dressing room. Decades later, a member of the crew would recall, "I had never witnessed him so profoundly disturbed." Newman possessed the capacity to exert control over every facet of his life, his performances, his public persona, his career trajectory, yet he seemed utterly incapable of commanding himself when in the presence of Elizabeth Taylor. In the subsequent days, an palpable strangeness permeated the atmosphere on set. The undeniable chemistry evident on screen was not merely a product of their acting, it was a tangible record of two individuals wrestling with an inconvenient truth. This was the apprehension Elizabeth Taylor spoke of. It was not the dread of public scandal, but rather the fear of a genuine emotion, a potent what-if that threatened to shatter the life Paul Newman had meticulously constructed with his wife. It was the chilling realization that the only man who mirrored her own intensity was also the only man she could never possess. The enigma of their true feelings and the remarkable self-restraint they exercised likely constitutes their most enduring performance. Throughout cinematic history, there exist scripts meticulously penned on paper, and then there are those forged by the palpable tension that hangs in the air. The narrative of Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman firmly belongs to the latter category. When the cameras rolled, they were two souls inexorably drawn to one another, entangled within a suffocating dramatic conflict. However, the instant the director's voice commanded "cut," reality descended with a force more profound than any on-screen scene. Witnesses to the filming of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof recount a consistent and striking pattern. Newman, a man celebrated for his off-camera warmth, maintained an almost clinical distance from Taylor. It was as if an invisible barrier had been erected between them. Elizabeth Taylor, a woman accustomed to the unwavering adoration of every man she encountered, experienced the sting of rejection for the very first time. And this was not rejection stemming from Brick, her character, but directly from Paul Newman himself. During a respite from filming, she approached director Richard Brooks, her voice laced with frustration. "He is so cold," she reportedly conveyed to him. "But I sense a fervent inferno burning beneath that cold exterior." Brooks, possessing a keen understanding of the unfolding situation, merely offered a knowing smile. His subsequent response would become legendary within the annals of Hollywood. "You two do not need to act," he stated. "You are Brick and Maggie." And he was entirely correct. Amidst those unsettling scenes, the hushed staircases and the clipped, deliberate dialogue, individuals on set began to genuinely believe that the pair were not merely enacting their roles. A seasoned lighting technician articulated the sentiment with profound insight. "I had witnessed numerous exceptional actors at work," he explained, "but this was something entirely different. Even after the cameras ceased their operation, they would continue to exchange glances as if the dialogue had never ended." Upon its release, the film captivated audiences across the globe. The tempestuous romance depicted in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof swiftly became a cultural phenomenon, propelling both stars to unparalleled legendary status. However, away from the public eye, hushed whispers began to circulate throughout Hollywood. "That did not appear to be acting," observers commented. And quite naturally, this very sentiment only served to deepen the pervasive mystery surrounding their on-screen connection. If their entire portrayal had been mere pretense, why did they both conspicuously avoid discussing the film for years thereafter? Once filming concluded, Hollywood buzzed with activity. The film's extraordinary commercial success garnered an impressive 6 Academy Award nominations, including 2 for both Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman. Yet, the subject of much discussion at exclusive gatherings and in clandestine restaurant corners was not the accolades. Instead, it was the events that transpired when the cameras ceased their operation. They were no longer embodying a married couple on screen. Nevertheless, that profound look they shared, the one etched indelibly into the memories of countless viewers, seemed to linger. To truly comprehend the immense magnitude of this unresolved tension, it is imperative to examine the context of their lives during that precise period. It represented a perfect confluence of profound vulnerability and staunch loyalty. In 1958, mere months prior to the commencement of filming, Taylor was emerging from the most devastating tragedy of her life. Her third husband, the esteemed producer Mike Todd, whom she had unequivocally described as the paramount love of her existence, had perished in a tragic airplane accident in New Mexico. Utterly heartbroken, she withdrew from the Hollywood social scene for several weeks. Friends recounted that Taylor abstained from sleep for days on end until MGM presented her with the opportunity to star in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. She accepted the role not for the advancement of her career, but as a means of escaping her unbearable grief. Newman, conversely, was at the zenith of both his professional achievements and his personal life. He had recently wed actress Joan Woodward, a woman widely regarded as his steadfast anchor and moral compass. Hollywood revered them, hailing them as cinema's golden couple, a symbol of unwavering stability amidst a world of pervasive chaos. Yet Newman himself would later acknowledge the considerable pressure he experienced during that period. Back then, he stated in a retrospective interview years later, "I was too young to fully comprehend that fidelity transcends mere avoidance of temptation. It encompasses the meticulous control of one's innermost emotions." And that critical boundary was subjected to numerous rigorous tests throughout his months of professional association with Elizabeth Taylor. Crew members vividly recalled the palpable tension that permeated their interactions during press tours. Taylor and Newman frequently found themselves seated together at press conferences. She, with a mischievous glint in her violet eyes, would occasionally engage him playfully. "If I were Maggie in real life, would you still be running away?" she once posed to him in the presence of numerous reporters. Newman, caught somewhat off guard, offered only a faint smile, but it was a smile that, according to those who witnessed it, conveyed an underlying tension palpable to everyone in the room. On another notable occasion, at the 1959 Academy Awards ceremony, Taylor graced the event in a resplendent white silk gown. Her smile was gentle, yet her eyes held an unspoken depth of emotion. As Newman approached to extend his congratulations on her nomination, she softly, almost a whisper, remarked, "I wish Mike Todd were here to witness this." Newman remained still for a significant moment. Then, momentarily deviating from his practiced reserve, he lightly touched her hand and murmured, "If he were here, I believe he would be immensely proud, and perhaps also quite envious." A shared brief laughter ensued, but the moment endured for mere seconds. It was precisely long enough for a photographer to capture the image, igniting weeks of sensational headlines. Despite this, when directly questioned, they both steadfastly maintained, "We are simply friends." However, in the insular world of Hollywood, the declaration, "We are simply friends," invariably serves as the catalyst for the most fervent curiosity. Their most candid revelations emerged much later, once the passage of time had effectively calmed the emotional waters. In a subsequent interview, Elizabeth Taylor offered a statement that many universally assumed referred to Newman. "There are eyes that make you forget who you are," she mused. "Paul Newman's eyes are one such example. Indeed, those piercing blue eyes, exuding a cool, measured restraint, yet brimming with an elusive tenderness, captivated not only the public at large, but even a woman who had, by then, witnessed the full spectrum of human experience." When Newman was queried about Taylor, his response proved even more revealing. He stated with striking simplicity, "It is too intense." He elaborated further, "I fear that if we were to take one more step, we would both lose ourselves." That singular sentence functioned as both a profound confession and a subtle compliment. It represented the critical boundary he was desperately striving to uphold, to remain steadfast, and to safeguard the home he had so recently established. Those acquainted with him affirmed that Newman consistently endeavored to maintain a deliberate distance from Taylor at public functions. Nevertheless, whenever their paths inevitably converged, he could not entirely conceal his palpable unease. Paul is invariably calm, always in absolute control, a member of his staff once observed. But whenever she makes an appearance, he transforms. His smile diminishes, his speech becomes more deliberate, and he never dares to meet her gaze for an extended period. Taylor, conversely, seemed unable to suppress her profound fascination with him. She once playfully confided in her close friend, Montgomery Clift, "He drives me to distraction, not because I am in love with him, but because I cannot fathom how he can maintain such an unyielding composure." The more they attempted to suppress their burgeoning emotions, the more inexorably they found themselves drawn into that vortex of feeling. They both understood implicitly that if they were to transgress that unspoken line, the repercussions would be catastrophic. Their marriages would crumble, their carefully cultivated reputations would be irrevocably damaged, and their public personas would be shattered. Consequently, they chose the path of silence. However, within the confines of that profound silence, certain sentiments persisted, resonating with an extraordinary and enduring power. A keen observer of human nature once penned, "Paul Newman and Elizabeth Taylor require no overt gestures of affection, no embraces or kisses. The very moment they are perceived in the same vicinity, the atmosphere undergoes a palpable transformation. It transcended mere physical attraction. It evolved into an inexplicable bond, a form of connection understood only by those who have navigated the precarious precipice between moral rectitude and overwhelming desire. And perhaps precisely because they never allowed that connection to fully materialize, that bond endured eternally, akin to a concealed ember that never completely extinguished." For many decades, the prevailing narrative maintained that the intense dynamic between Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman ceased the moment the cameras stopped rolling. Hollywood readily embraced this sanitized version of events. However, what remained unforeseen, what lay dormant in the deepest recesses of memory, was the eventual revelation by Elizabeth Taylor herself, years later, that this profound connection had indeed teetered on the brink of igniting with uncontrollable force. And according to individuals close to them, that very moment marked the genesis of their true, enduring secret. A flame, a sentiment they both believed they had irrevocably extinguished after their time on set, but which, in reality, never truly died. It merely lay dormant, quiescent, much like a slumbering volcano, awaiting a fateful night to erupt, even if only for a fleeting instant. The vibrant backdrop of Hollywood, bathed in the summer sun of 1958. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof had recently concluded its post-production phase, yet the exhaustive work was far from over. Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman were still obligated to navigate the relentless media frenzy, attend joint test screenings, participate in promotional photo shoots, and endure often uncomfortable interviews. Both were acutely aware that a fundamental shift had occurred between them. It was no longer a subtle tremor perceptible only on screen. It had evolved into a tangible, authentic connection. This bond had become so profound that it began to instill a sense of unease within them. The interviews transformed into perilous minefields, with the air thick with unspoken tension. When questioned about her esteemed co-star, Taylor would offer a smile, though her expressive violet eyes would subtly evade the camera's lens. "He makes me forget that I am acting," she once confided. As for Newman, a man renowned for his unshakable composure, his responses were invariably brief. One persistent journalist in pursuit of an exclusive scoop pressed further. "What does he truly think of Miss Taylor?" Newman paused and then uttered a single word that resonated with chilling finality throughout the room. "She is dangerous," he declared. "Dangerous." The tabloids readily interpreted this statement as a reference to her breathtaking beauty. But the truth lay far deeper. She was dangerous, not due to any seductive allure, but because she had compelled Newman to confront the unsettling realization that his heart, the very heart he had irrevocably pledged to his wife, Joan Woodward, was no longer entirely secure. The tension reached its absolute zenith on a particular evening in early June. The film's production company hosted an intimate gathering at the opulent Beverly Hills Hotel to commemorate the film's early acclaim. Amidst the convivial clamor, the clinking of glasses, and the effervescent champagne, Taylor and Newman found themselves seated at opposite ends of the grand table. Their verbal exchanges were minimal. However, witnesses present that evening recount a different narrative, one of furtive glances and unspoken communication. Every time she emitted a laugh, his gaze would subtly drift in her direction. Each time he rose from his seat, she would unconsciously shift her body to align with the trajectory of his wandering eyes. No one uttered a word aloud, yet those observing them could palpably sense an extraordinary, almost electrifying energy emanating between them. She appeared so taut with suppressed emotion that, as one assistant later described it, one could have cut the air with a knife. Following the conclusion of the party, Taylor returned to her modest apartment on North Crescent Drive. The dwelling overlooked a tranquil street, shaded by gracefully swaying palm trees. She was alone in the process of removing her makeup when a distinct knock echoed at her door. She had not anticipated any visitors. Standing at her doorstep was Paul Newman. The persona was not Brick, the character he embodied. It was Paul, the man. He was dressed in a slightly rumpled white shirt. His famed blue eyes, though appearing weary, held a resolute determination. The world seemed to momentarily halt. "You shouldn't be here," she managed, her voice a faint, almost hoarse whisper. "I know," Newman replied, his voice firm. "But I need to say this. I need to say this before we both commit to the pretense that it never happened." They settled themselves, facing one another. The only illumination emanated from a warm, yellow lamp filtering through the curtains. The pretense of cameras, the constraints of scripts, the nuances of subtlety, all had vanished. It was simply two individuals, raw and exposed, profoundly weary, and desperately attempting to avert a catastrophic fall from grace. Newman commenced speaking, his voice slow and raspy, perhaps a consequence of the evening's libations, or more likely, the accumulated confusion of months. The words he uttered would indelibly shape the remainder of their lives. "If I didn't have Joan," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't think I could leave this room." Taylor's silence was profound, a heavy shroud. Neither of them offered a smile. Neither reached out to touch the other. She simply gazed at him for a long, extended duration. Then, with a tremor he valiantly attempted to conceal, he responded, "And because you do have Joan, you must leave." Newman offered no further words. He understood. He rose, opened the door, and stepped out into the dim hallway. However, before departing entirely, he turned back. The look in her eyes at that precise moment was so intensely profound, so steeped in sorrow, and so replete with an unfulfillable love that Taylor would later chronicle in her private journal. "I lived for many more years," she wrote, "but no one ever again gazed upon me with such an expression." The subsequent morning, the relentless machinery of Hollywood resumed its operations without pause. They convened for an MGM photo session. Not a single word was exchanged regarding the events of the previous night, not the slightest hint of the conversation that had irrevocably altered their worlds. They both smiled for the camera, their expressions so flawlessly composed that no one within the studio could possibly have surmised that mere hours before they had stood precariously on the knife's edge, separating passionate love from unyielding conscience. Years later, within the confines of a hidden notebook Taylor meticulously maintained, she committed the unvarnished truth about that pivotal night to paper. "It was the most beautiful and the most brutal moment of my existence," she wrote. "Beautiful," she explained, "because I was afforded the profound understanding of what true love entails. Brutal, because I was compelled to relinquish the object of my most fervent desire." In that fleeting instant, she grasped the full weight of the potential consequences. Had they ventured one step further, they would have collectively forfeited everything. Paul Newman would cease to be Joan Woodward's devoted partner, the woman who had stood steadfastly beside him through the arduous years preceding his ascendance to fame, and Elizabeth Taylor, long stigmatized as a seductive force that invariably brings misfortune, would have once again found herself at the epicenter of an unprecedented media storm, particularly after having narrowly navigated the profound tragedy of losing her husband, Mike Todd. They both deliberately chose silence, yet within that profound quietude, an element of their connection remained indelibly present. For decades, Hollywood whispered rumors of a clandestine encounter between them, but Taylor consistently refrained from offering any confirmation. Sources intimately connected to her attest that in the ensuing years, whenever a Paul Newman film premiered in theaters, Taylor would quietly attend, purchase a ticket, and position herself alone in the darkened rear section of the auditorium. Newman, for his part, rarely spoke of Taylor in his interviews. However, invariably, when his name was mentioned by a journalist, he would offer a subtle smile and then avert his gaze. It was only in his later years, during a recorded conversation, that Taylor alluded to the truth with a veiled yet poignant observation. "We made the righteous choice," she remarked, "but at an inopportune moment." That singular phrase effectively quelled all lingering speculation, yet simultaneously reopened an old wound. Because, as is often the case, the most excruciating truths are not necessarily the mistakes we commit, but rather the correct decisions we are compelled to make, despite the profound loss they entail. And this was the burden Elizabeth Taylor carried with her until the very end of her life. A quiet night, an unspoken line of dialogue, and a man who never forgot. While that singular memory remained shrouded in darkness, their individual lives embarked upon trajectories that diverged dramatically. They became akin to parallel lines, destined to intersect miraculously only once, and then to separate eternally. Paul Newman ultimately reunited with Joan Woodward. She returned to the role of the calm and devoted wife, consistently staying removed from the clamor of Hollywood. Over time, their union became a beacon, an almost unattainable symbol of enduring commitment amidst a world rife with temptation. Together, they established a sanctuary in Westport, Connecticut, deliberately distanced from the glare and revelry of show business. Newman launched the Newman's Own food enterprise, demonstrating extraordinary benevolence by dedicating all its profits to charitable causes. He solidified his reputation as a paragon of integrity. Following that clandestine encounter on North Crescent Drive, the narrative of Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman did not conclude, rather, it diverged. Like two celestial bodies that briefly intersected, their individual paths irrevocably separated, each embarking on a distinct trajectory. Paul Newman found solace and returned to the embrace of Joan Woodward, his steadfast and gentle wife, who had always navigated clear of Hollywood's relentless demands. They forged a bastion of unwavering fidelity in Westport, Connecticut, a haven far removed from the allure and pitfalls of fame. Newman initiated his food venture, Newman's Own, channeling every cent of its earnings to benevolent organizations. He became an emblem of unimpeachable character. Admirers lauded him as the epitome of kindness in Hollywood, the man who, against all odds, remained devoted to a single woman throughout his lifetime. Elizabeth Taylor, the cinematic embodiment of a passionate violet, seemed destined for a contrasting existence. Their intertwined fates were marked by dazzling unpredictability. After the eventful night of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, his stardom soared, yet his personal life remained turbulent. She subsequently married Eddie Fisher, the closest confidant of her late husband, Mike Todd. This union ignited public outrage across America, with many labeling her a home wrecker. Subsequent years brought divorce, then the earth-shattering whirlwind of Richard Burton, followed by another divorce. A remarriage to Burton ensued, culminating in 8 marriages in total. 8 times she signed legal documents that others deemed erratic, while she simply characterized it as a persistent search for love. Yet a spectral presence seemed to attend each of her nuptials. In every interview, irrespective of the man in question, Fisher, Burton, Hilton, Taylor deftly eluded the core of the deepest inquiries, offering only a knowing smile and a veiled remark. "There was someone who made me believe in true love, but I let him go," she would cryptically state. While she never divulged his name, those within Hollywood's inner circle understood. It was not Burton nor Fisher. It was the name conspicuously absent from all discussion, Paul Newman. Their professional collaboration ceased after that singular film. No correspondence was exchanged, and not even a formal parting occurred after that fateful night. Nevertheless, for years, they were occasionally observed at the same social gatherings, maintaining a respectful distance, exchanging courteous greetings, and, according to onlookers, their gazes would invariably soften, if only for a fleeting moment, upon encountering each other. The apex of public tension occurred in 1973 at the Academy Awards ceremony. Elizabeth Taylor was slated to present the award for Best Picture. The film honored was The Sting, featuring Paul Newman. Those present in the auditorium that evening reported a palpable hush falling over the room. As she announced the winning film, her normally steady voice faltered slightly. Paul Newman, seated in the front row, offered a subtle nod accompanied by a composed smile. It was the same carefully controlled expression, the same unruffled demeanor, the identical smile that Taylor would later confide to a friend. "He's still the same. Calm, polite, and cold enough to drive me crazy." Following that presentation, it is said Taylor lingered in the backstage corridor for an extended period. She watched as Newman was enveloped by the throngs of journalists and well-wishers. She made no move to approach him, nor did she call out his name. Perhaps she recognized that some encounters are not meant for repetition. The mere knowledge of their continued existence somewhere in the world sufficed. Paul Newman remained by Joan Woodward's side until his passing. Their union, spanning over 50 years, stands as a remarkable achievement amidst Hollywood's volatile landscape. Elizabeth Taylor, despite her succession of romantic entanglements and heartbreaks, preserved a small, inviolable sanctuary within her heart. In a 2007 interview during her retirement and reflective years, a journalist posed the inevitable question, "If you could revisit the past, what would you alter?" Her response was immediate and unvarnished. "I wouldn't have let him leave that room." This declaration left the interviewer momentarily stunned. For it is often the case that our most profound torment stems not from what we have lost, but from what we have never truly possessed. Among the countless images of Elizabeth Taylor adorning the halls of the Film Institute, only one captured with Paul Newman was retained in her personal quarters. This photograph, taken behind the scenes in 1958, shows him gazing in her direction, unaware of the camera's presence. For half a century, regardless of the men or the turmoil that graced her life, Taylor never permitted anyone to disturb that photograph. For some recollections, even those confined to a single night, possess the enduring power to accompany us through life's entirety. For over 50 years, Elizabeth Taylor refrained from publicly mentioning Paul Newman in a romantic context. However, in 2010, as her health deteriorated, she granted a final interview to the PBS network from her memory-filled residence in Burr. Her voice was soft, but her legendary violet eyes, the very ones that had captivated the world, still held a remarkable luminescence. The interviewer posed the culminating question: of all the individuals you've encountered, who do you regret the most? Taylor remained silent for a considerable duration, her gaze drifting towards the window where the afternoon sun cast its gentle light upon the garden. Then, with a tender smile, she broke a half-century of silence. Paul Newman? The interviewer showed a flicker of surprise. His name had never been officially linked to any of her documented romantic relationships, but Taylor continued, her voice barely a whisper, "Because I never told him I loved him." The words hung in the quiet air of the room. There were no tears, no elaborate justifications, merely the profound calm of someone who had carried a profound burden for far too long. "He is the only man who ever made me fear myself," she added. "I was afraid that if I expressed it sooner, if I allowed myself to feel it, I would cease to be myself." It was not a confession, but a belated farewell. The parting words of a woman who had lived vibrantly, loved passionately, and who, on one singular occasion, chose silence, fearing that happiness might jeopardize the little she had left. When the interviewer inquired once more if she would alter her actions, had she the chance to return to 1958, Taylor smiled. Her eyes radiated a warmth tinged with melancholy. "No one can conquer time. We made the right choice, but at the wrong juncture." This statement brought a hush to the studio. Few realized it would also be the final time Elizabeth Taylor would utter Paul Newman's name. A year later, in 2011, she passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 79. As her personal effects were being catalogued, numerous mementos were discovered in her private chambers, photographs, unsent letters, and within a mahogany drawer, an aged photograph. It was the candid shot from the set of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in Scaliente from 1958. In it, Taylor is captured in laughter while Newman looks at her, his expression as tender as it had been half a century prior. The reason for her lifelong preservation of this photograph remains unknown. Perhaps it served as a constant reminder of a love that never found formal expression, a private chapter she chose to preserve indefinitely. It is said that certain secrets are not meant for public revelation, but are instead carried silently to the very end. For decades, the world presumed Elizabeth Taylor would take her most profound secrets to her grave. However, Elizabeth Taylor did not. On the precipice of life and death, bearing the weight of her legendary status, she finally spoke. She articulated what she had perpetually feared to acknowledge aloud: that her true love resided not within the tempestuous realm of her 8 tumultuous marriages, but within a quiet interlude, a silent moment with the one man she could never possess. And perhaps in the mere act of voicing it, she finally achieved liberation. Paul Newman's poignant declaration because I never told him I loved him endures as one of Hollywood's most beautiful yet sorrowful farewell pronouncements. Its resonance stems from more than mere regret. It is the ultimate testament to the fact that even individuals who appear to possess everything, those seemingly flawless human beings, often carry an unhealing scar. Elizabeth Taylor lived with the brilliance of a conflagration, loved with the force of a storm, and departed with profound peace. Yet the ember, named Paul Newman, ignited on an MGM sound stage in 1957, perhaps never extinguished, but simply learned to burn inwardly. Some affections require no beginning nor end. Their sole purpose is to exist, quietly residing in the shared memories of two individuals brave enough to hold them for a lifetime. Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman stand as living proof of this. They made no vows, exchanged no marriage promises. Nevertheless, a single glance, a single unuttered sentiment sufficed to ensure that, half a century later, the world still speaks of them with an undimmed sense of nostalgia. As Elizabeth Taylor closed the final chapter of a life as dazzling as it was tear-filled, people finally grasped a profound truth. Sometimes the most devastating revelation is not a concealed secret. The most devastating truth is genuine love, the very love we are compelled to conceal to preserve the lingering beauty in the world. She had loved, yet dared not utter it. He had understood, yet could not respond. And between them, only one element remained: silence. A silence that endured for half a century, possessing a strength greater than any scandal, a longevity exceeding any marriage, and a resonance louder than any ovation. If you too believe that beneath the glittering facade of Hollywood lie hearts capable of love, fear, and pain just like our own, then please share this story, and subscribe to this channel. Join me on a voyage to uncover untold narratives where legends are not merely revered, but are experienced as deeply human beings. For occasionally what renders a star immortal is not the brilliance they emit, but the inner fire they possess. Even if that flame ignites only once in a lifetime, 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 indeed,